Hello and welcome back. Today we're going to learn how to buff. First, I'm going to show you how to buff just simple, smaller, flat sheet metal pieces. And then I'm going to show you how to buff something with a form, like a bracelet or a larger neck piece. It's really important in buffing that you are safe. The outcome of buffing is incredibly satisfying. You start and you have a piece that looks pretty nice, but it's still not shiny and totally lovely, and you end with a piece that's bright and shiny and sparkly and beautiful. To be ready to buff, you need to make sure that your metal is done being soldered. If you've etched, it's done being etched. Any texturizing you've done, any forming you've done, everything's done except buffing. Buffing is the last step. And you want to make sure you've got a really nice sand to 600. You spent a lot of time on that 600 step. It'll save you time on the buff. You could even sand up to 1500 if you decide buffing's not your favorite thing to do. If you sand up to 1500, you'll have to spend a little less time on the buff, which is nice. So make sure your metal is ready so it saves you time on the buff. And the next really important thing with buffing is safety. We have a couple different safety concerns, okay? Concern number one is it's a rotary motor, so anything that gets caught in it gets pulled into it. So if my hair gets caught in that motor, in the spindle of the buff, it's going to pull and spin my hair up, and then it's going to continue to pull it in and catch more hair. And that sounds awful, right? Yeah, it would be, because it would literally pull the hair out of your head. And so we need to make sure that we don't have anything that could potentially get caught in a buff. To do that, hair gets tied up. 100%, okay? I would even take off my earrings that are a little bit more dangly today for buffing. If I had on a necklace, I would take that off. I had on a sweatshirt that had strings hanging down. I would either tuck the strings in or take that sweatshirt off. I have a cardigan on right now that's kind of long and loose, and the fabric from that could flow in. So I'd want to make sure to either take that off or cover it up like I have with my smock here. So number one is rotary motor means nothing that could get caught in it. Everything tied back really securely, okay? Okay, tie it back. I'm serious on this one. It's really a dangerous proposition to get something caught in there. The next thing we're worried about is things from the buff that could get caught and fly out, and we don't want them to hit our eyes, so we wear goggles. Additionally, with buffing, there's dust that gets thrown up in the air, and it's nice to not get that in our eyeballs. When we buff, we use a buffing compound, and I make sure to purchase buffing compounds that are silica-free, because silica is really the danger. You don't want to breathe silica in. It's the same thing that's in clay dust that we don't want to breathe in. So I have silica-free buffing compound, but it still throws dust up. So whenever we buff, 100% of the time, we wear a good mask, okay? I give each one of my students at the beginning of the semester one of these masks. It's theirs for the rest of the semester. So pop this on when you're buffing, even if it annoys you because it fogs up your glasses, okay? It's important to wear this mask. Otherwise, all the dust from this gets in your nose and in your lungs, and we don't want to put things in our lungs other than clean, fresh, lovely air. So, safety again. Anything loose is tied up, goggles are on, mask is on. The other thing I always put on when I buff is a smock, because it's pretty dirty, and I don't want to get my clothes full of buffing compound and the dirt from it. So I always wear a smock. One thing to be careful of if you're one of my students in school, these smocks have little strings that when we tighten it up around the neck hang down. And you can imagine this hanging down is probably not safe for buffing. So you either need to tie it up or tuck it in really securely. Okay? Before you go to the buff, metal sanded at least to 600, if not 1500, and you just double check your body for safety. So put those goggles on, put your masks on, and join me for buffing. All right, let's get started. I've got my hair up, goggles on, smock on. I have my mask ready to go when I actually start buffing. Here's our buff that we're going to use. We have 3 different buffs that you can see here in the background. They all function very similarly. The on-off switch for each of the buffs is in front, and there's also a toggle switch in the back for vents to pull away some of that dust as we buff. If you look at my setup here, I have a paper towel and the 2 things that I'm going to be working on buffing. When you're buffing your metal, it's causing friction, and friction creates what? heat. So as you're buffing, these are going to heat up. So I like to buff more than one thing at a time. So when this piece gets too hot, I can move to this piece. When this gets too hot, I can just kind of move back and forth. I like to have a paper towel to store my stuff on just so when it's sitting here, there's going to be vibration in this. I'm not vibrating this metal on metal and scratching the back. On my buff, there is the toggle up front. It has an option of going slow or fast. If you go slow, it'll buff, but it's going to take a lot longer, so we always buff on the fast speed. I'm going to kind of orient you to buffing with the buff off so that you can hear what I'm saying, and then once I actually start buffing, I'll put on my mask and do voiceovers. When we buff, this wheel is turning this way, turns towards us, and we always want to buff. If you think of the head of this wheel like a clock, this is noon, this is 6 o'clock, we want to buff between 3 and 5, so this kind of bottom front quarter of the wheel. If we buff too high or too low, it's going to want to grab our metal and it'll fling it back into the machine and back out at us. So when we buff, we're holding our metal about here. Okay? When we're buffing, we also want to move the metal. You don't just hold it in one place. You push and move back and forth, and you keep turning it. Push and move, push and move, push and move. So I'm going to show you all of this with the buff on, my mask on, and I'll do some voiceover on what I'm doing in particular. Remember, folks, just be safe when you come over to this buff. Double check your safety. Make sure that you have earbuds out, nothing hanging down. If you're one of my students, you need to be able to hear me if I come over near you and I say, hey, you might want to blah, blah, blah. So no earbuds in at the buff, just like there shouldn't be earbuds in at the soldering station or at the drill, okay? Focus on what you're doing, my friends. Let's get started. All right, here's buffed versus unbuffed. First thing you're going to do is touch a little bit of polishing compound on the wheel. Please do not use too much. If you use too much, it'll layer up black gunk on your piece and it'll never get polished. When you're polishing, you want to make sure that you're pushing hard into the wheel. The harder you push, the faster it buffs. It'll also heat up faster, so keep that in mind. You're going to make sure that as you push, you're moving things back and forth. And keep in mind, this is sped up to like 4 times the tempo. So don't go quite as fast as you see me going in this video. But push and move back and forth, up and down, doesn't really matter. Just make sure you're moving. You're getting the edges as well as the tops and the backs of your piece. A well-polished piece is polished throughout the entire piece. You're making sure that you're staying at that 430-ish position. And you want to make sure that you're really holding tight to that metal. That buff is moving pretty quick and it's going to want to grab your piece. Another thing that you want to be aware of is there's something called an autonomic nerve response. When your fingers are holding this metal, it's starting to heat up because you're pushing really hard, right? Because I told you to push hard. Make sure you're paying attention to that heat. If it gets too hot, your body's going to respond automatically. That's the autonomic nerve response. Your nerves in your fingers will feel heat. They will send a signal through that nerve to your spinal column. Your spinal column will yell, danger, and send a signal back to your fingers to drop your object, which you don't want to do. You don't want to drop this piece that you've worked so hard on. So pay attention to that heat. When it gets too hot, set it up on top of the buff and grab your second piece and buff with that one for a while. It's important that you pay attention to this. You can see me switching back and forth, and occasionally I will add more buffing compound to my piece. If you get too much buffing compound on the wheel, it'll kind of layer up a black deposit on the surface of your piece, which is telling you you have too much buffing compound on the wheel. You're going to need to take a fingernail and kind of scrape that off to continue buffing, because once that buffing compound is layered in there, it's going to be stuck. Here I'm pointing out a scratch in the surface, trying to get a good angle to show you. And I'm going to try to get that scratch out. I'm going to try to make sure that I've got a fine mirror finish to this. You don't want to see any marks from sanding when you're done. Again, the harder you push, the better job you're going to have with your buffing and the quicker it's going to go.
Yes, it gets hotter, but you know what? I'd rather have it be a little bit hot than spend an hour and a half buffing a single piece. A lot of times, my students, as they start down this journey of buffing, will spend about 5 times longer at the buff than is necessary because they don't push their piece and they don't move it while they're buffing. There's a lot of issues with angles as well. So while you were watching me buff, I hope you were noticing that I use the edges of my buff as well as the front edge of it as well. So I use the corners of the buff to get into tough spots, especially where there's soldered areas on my pieces. So push, pay attention to that heat, and hold really tight to your metal. If you look at my fingers, you can see that there's a strong grip at all times.
All right, at this point, I believe that I'm done buffing these two pieces, these pendants. You can see that there's buffing compound, that's what looks dirty, stuck down in the etch there in that texture. And I'm going to need to be able to clean that off. My edges and the backs of my pieces are also well buffed, so I know I'm done. This piece still needs some work. There's a couple places, and I don't know if the camera will catch it, a little bit right there. You can see there's a scratch. That scratch is not going to buff out. I'm going to need to go back in probably with 320, not on the whole thing, but just here where these two little scratches are. 320, 400, 600, and then come back to the buff to finish this up. But again, I've got a lot of buffing compound kind of stuck on my metal. So my next step is cleaning this up and cleaning up my hands. You can see it's a pretty dirty job. You can also see why we don't want this in our lungs, why we wear goggles, and why I wear a smock to keep myself clean. This is our sonic cleaner. This is what we use to clean our jewelry. It's really simple to use. Inside it, there's just a solution of water and 409 cleaning solution. We're going to place our pieces into that cleaning solution. I usually put them in upside down. Close up the lid. On the front of the machine, we've got some settings. You just push set once for a normal pair of earrings or something with like just a real simple smooth surface. I've got texturized surface, so I'm going to do set twice, and then I'm going to push on. And what happens is there's a sonic action in there that kind of shakes the dirt off and the grease off, because buffing compound is a combination of a grease and suspended within that kind of oily solution that polishes and protects the surface. There are very small pieces of particles that buff or polish the piece. So we need to get that grease and dirt out. Once I've got that set, I'll push on. The time has run out, so I'm simply going to open it up, grab my pieces out, and then I take a toothbrush, I dip it in the solution, and I pop over to the sink. At the sink, I'll turn on a little warm water. Just take that solution and I'm going to scrub a little bit. And you can see that that buffing compound's starting to come out. Now on an etched piece, you're probably going to have to put this in for a second round to get things out. And every once in a while on an etched piece, there's just some spots where the buffing compound doesn't want to come out. And I'll go into those spots with a little needle and I'll kind of pick it away after 2 rounds. When you are doing this with untexturized metal, you usually don't even have to use a toothbrush. You can just use a paper towel and rub it, and any remaining buffing compound will pop off. You can see it's already started to do its work here. So I'm going to finish scrubbing off those other pieces. I'll probably put them in for another round because I want to get rid of where we can still see that black buffing compound here. Double check your edges, the backs of your pieces, and things like that as well. Let's talk about getting the buffing compound off your hands. You can see some of it's already come off using just what's that 409 cleaner that was in the bin with me. At school, next to our sinks, we have a kind of a special shop scrub that we use. So I'm just going to use that on my hands, scrub it up. So it's kind of grainy and greasy all at the same time. And what it does is it breaks down the oil in the buffing compound and kind of scrubs off what's left. Cleans it up really, really well. I only use this when I have to because it also dries my skin out. Because if its point is to dissolve oil, it's going to dissolve the oils in your skin as well. At home, good soaps to use are Gojo is a brand that you can get at most hardware stores. Lava soap works really well as well. That comes in a bar and I think a liquid form. but there's a lot of different things that you can get that get your hands pretty clean. So at this point, my hands are pretty clean. I just need to scrub under my nails a little bit. When I use this stuff, I always follow up with soap because, I don't know, it seems like pretty strong stuff and I don't want to actually get it in my eyes. So I'm just going to use regular soap, do a final wash and dry, and I'm good to go. All right, here's our pieces all buffed up and beautiful. You can see they have a nice sparkle. They've been well cleaned, looking good. So as you can see, it's not necessarily a difficult process, but there's a lot of things to think about and it is kind of dirty. So just watch the temperature in your hands, hold tight, take a break if you need to, and don't be afraid to push hard. The whole process goes much more quickly if you push hard. So we can buff some simple pieces. Let's talk about buffing a shape like this. This is a bracelet. It's three-dimensional, and there's some things that you need to be aware of safety-wise in buffing a piece like this or a larger piece. So first of all the old safety rules still apply. You need to make sure that you are safe. Your goggles are on, hair's tied up, anything that's dangling is put away, and that you've got your mask on when you're buffing. When we buff an object like this, we're going to be turning it as we buff. And when we turn it down, this lower ledge can get caught too far underneath that buffing wheel and it's going to want to pull us. Anytime we have a bigger piece that we're buffing, you need to be aware of not just where the piece is touching the buff, but where other edges of that piece exist in relation to the buff. So I'm going to show this to you from a different angle here. Okay, here's the buff, here's my bracelet. When I'm buffing in the middle here, there's really no edges to worry about. But watch what happens as I start to buff this edge. Do you see how this bottom edge right here is getting close to the buff? And if I do this, this bottom edge is going to touch the buff's going to get caught there and pull my bracelet in and back into the buff. If that happens, turn off the buff, wait for it to stop, and go retrieve your bracelet. You might have to reform it because it could get dented. Usually it won't ruin the piece, okay? So let's take a look at buffing a piece like this, just being careful for your different angles.
All right, first thing, make sure you've got a really good grip on your piece. If you look at the nails on my thumbs, you can see they're turning white because I'm holding really tight. I do not want the wheel to grab my piece. And you're gonna notice as soon as you buff a piece like this bracelet or anything with soldering where there's more edges that the wheel can grab, you're gonna feel that wheel pulling your piece away from you. Get a darn good grip on your piece. You're also going to notice with this piece that I use the edges of the wheel a lot. I work from one end of the bracelet to the other. I'm moving it in different directions so that when I'm buffing, that buff is coming from on top of each leaf, underneath each leaf, the side of the leaf. I'm getting the edges. So I'm keeping all my heat on one end of my bracelet and I'm holding the other end. That allows me to really work that end pretty well and get that buff doing its job to the best of my ability. Also notice when I'm buffing the ends of my pieces, I'm always holding it really tight, and what you can't see is that I'm super concentrated on where all parts of my bracelet are in relation to the wheel at one time. Another thing to note when you're buffing something with a texture or with soldered elements, you'll go through the buffing compound just a little bit faster because you have all of that texture to grab the buff. I check my work often while I'm buffing to see what's getting buffed well and what needs more time. Here is another angle. You can see me working from the top. This gives you a better sense of using the edges of the wheel. You'll see me come into the edge of my different soldered pieces at different angles. There we go, so that I can make sure that I'm soldering all parts of my piece. A lot of times students struggle with getting to all parts of a piece that have soldered elements or that have a shape to it like this does or a form. And the trick is to use the edges of the wheel. Use those corners to get into your edges. Check your work often, push hard, pay attention to the heat. If you need to set it down and let it cool for a while, set it down and let it cool. You don't want to get it so hot that you loosen your grip and then that wheel catches your piece and pulls it back and smashes it into the back of the buff. And if it happens, it happens. I've had many pieces get smashed into the buff or ricocheted off into the floor of my studio or the studio at school. And there's a solution to everything. And sometimes the solution isn't our original idea, but there's always a solution to things. But if you hold tight, you pay attention to what you're doing, and you're really thoughtful about the time that you spend at this wheel, One, you'll have a great experience and a beautiful piece, and two, you'll minimize the risk of something getting pulled in. Don't forget to buff the edges of things well. I'm constantly checking those edges, and you'll see me do this in a few minutes here. I'm constantly checking the edges to make sure that it's comfortable. There's nothing that's going to scratch or grip at the person who wears this. You want to make sure that jewelry is comfortable, and polishing is a big part of that. So take your time in this step, really, really push and be very thoughtful about where all parts of your piece are in relation to that buff. Here you can see me checking that edge to make sure it's smooth. You shouldn't feel any kind of catch in that space. And if you do, you either need to sand it more or buff it more. I'm going to sand the inside of my bracelet with 600 sandpaper to finish that. And there you can see the finished beautiful buff on that etched surface, how shiny it is, how well it catches the light. It's really a satisfying experience.